3 patrol units pinned me into my own gravel driveway while my daughters watched, trembling from the
I
porch
want him
steps.
arrested now!
My
Ma'am,
neighbor,
please calm
Sheila
down.
Vance,
Don't tell me to calm
stood
down!
on
He
her
damaged my
manicured lawn
property!
across
We'll
the
handle
street.
this.
Her
Lied to
iPhone
me!
raised like a
I didn't
weapon,
have a choice.
likely
There's
telling
always
the
a choice!
dispatcher
Tell
I
me
was
the truth!
staging
It's
a
complicated.
hostile military-grade blockade just for parking my work truck at my own home. The scent of ozone from a passing storm mixed with the heavy exhaust of my government-issued diesel as the deputies stepped out, their thumbs hooked into their utility belts. "Sir, step back from the vehicle. We have a report of aggressive posturing," one officer shouted. Sheila watched with that narrow, satisfied squint common to suburban bullies who think they've finally landed a knockout blow. What she hadn't calculated was that the man she was trying to get hauled off in cuffs was the same man who'd be overseeing her husband's next federal security clearance review. That 911 call was the biggest mistake of her life. What would you do if a neighbor weaponized the police against you for the crime of existing in your own driveway? My name is Elias Thorne, and 4 months ago, I thought my primary stressor was overseeing logistical operations for 15,000 personnel at Fort Bragg. It turns out one 50-year-old HOA secretary named Sheila Vance would be more relentless than any tactical adversary I encountered during 4 tour in the Middle East. The crunch of boots on my driveway had become my morning meditation at 600. With my wife, Claire, currently stationed in South Korea, and our twin 9-year-olds to raise solo, I desperately needed our Oak Ridge neighborhood to be a fortress of peace. Toss in my 75-year-old father's declining memory, and you'll realize why a quiet home life wasn't a luxury. It was a requirement for survival. Dad served in the Marines, earned 2 silver stars, and now some mornings he looks at me like I'm a stranger in his kitchen. But his posture still straightens when he hears me calling out orders on a conference call. The smell of high-octane coffee at dawn brings him back to the barracks of 1970. For those fleeting minutes, the fog lifts and his eyes regain their fire. Sheila moved into the brick colonial across from us last spring, exactly 3 weeks after her husband's firm lost a multi-million-dollar base infrastructure bid. From day one, she signaled that military types were a blight on the neighborhood's prestige. Never mind that I'd owned this house for a decade, years longer than her. She drove a silver Mercedes SUV that she parked with surgical alignment every evening, as if she were prepping for a luxury car commercial. Her hedges were trimmed to the millimeter, and she wore a plastic, predatory smile that felt like a threat. The first real skirmish happened on a humid Tuesday in October. I'd parked my heavy-duty Ram in the driveway, slightly offset to let the kids get their scooters out, when Sheila marched across the pavement. She was clutching her phone like a piece of forensic evidence. Her neon-pink nails, the kind that cost a week's pay for a private, clicked against the glass as she snapped photos of my tires. "This is a quiet residential sanctuary, not a motor pool," she barked, her voice hitting that shrill, practiced tone of someone who was definitely the president of her sorority. "That vehicle is an eyesore and an obstruction to emergency response." The irony was thick, considering her SUV occupied more square footage than a small studio apartment. I kept my breathing steady, using the same de-escalation voice I used with hostile local leaders overseas. "Ma'am, it's my private lot. I'm well within the code." She didn't blink. "Uniforms don't grant you immunity from the rules, Colonel," she spat, already hitting speed dial. "Yes, police. I'm being intimidated by a neighbor who thinks he's above the law." 20 minutes later, Deputy Miller arrived. He'd seen me at veterans events and knew my reputation, but he had a job to do. I saw the apology in his posture as he asked the standard, redundant questions while Sheila stood behind him, nodding like a vulture waiting for a meal. That night, I stood on my deck, listening to the wind through the pines and watching my father prune his roses, the only thing that kept the shadows of his mind at bay. His hands, scarred and steady, worked the shears with the same precision he once used to calibrate a rifle. "Elias," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and clear. "That woman has the eyes of a commissar. She doesn't want order, she wants submission." Even with his mind failing him, Dad had Sheila Vance's number. I started observing her patterns then. I saw how she'd linger at her bay window during the afternoon bus drop-off, phone in hand like a reconnaissance officer. I noticed how she'd conveniently step outside whenever the other military families on the block gathered for a beer. This wasn't just a cranky neighbor. This was a targeted, high-frequency operation. 20 years in intelligence teaches you to spot a pattern before the enemy even knows they have one. This was systematic harassment. The folder I labeled Vance Incident Log grew by the day. By the next Friday, it held 6 formal HOA warnings, all issued in a 2-week span. Commercial vehicle in residential zone. Apparently my truck was a tank now. Noise violation. My 615 remote start was disturbing the peace. Unauthorized structural repair. Replaced a rotting fence picket. These weren't random gripes. They were surgical strikes, citing obscure bylaws buried in the 400-page community handbook. Sheila had weaponized the fine print. The smell of toner and paper filled my office as I mapped out the citations on a corkboard. Each one cited different neighbors as witnesses, different times and different codes. This was a paper trail designed to build a legal eviction case. Then came the Friday that turned my blood to ice. My daughter Lily burst through the door, her face a mask of tears. "Dad," she sobbed, "the drama teacher said I can't be the lead in the play because we might relocate before opening night." The metallic tang of fury hit the back of my throat. I knelt down, forcing my face to remain calm. "Who told her that, honey?" "The PTA ladies," she whispered. "They said military kids shouldn't take the big parts because they never finish what they start." My son Leo stood behind her, his small jaw set tight. "Mrs. Vance told the coach we're just renting the community's time." I held them both, feeling their hearts racing against mine. The injustice of it burned in my chest like a flare. Over their shoulders I saw Dad watching from his chair. His eyes were wide and lucid. He gave me a slow, sharp nod, the go signal. That night I brewed a pot of the strongest coffee I had and opened my laptop. If Sheila wanted to play the long game of information warfare, she just picked a fight with a professional. First, I pulled the HOA's digital archives, public records that most people never bother to read. HOA documents are a goldmine. They have to log every complaint, every complainant, and every outcome. It's an enemy's ledger. The data was undeniable. Within 90 minutes, I had the kill chain mapped out. Military families in our sector received 80% of all fines despite making up less than a quarter of the residents. Civilians got friendly reminders for the same things that cost us hundreds in penalties. Master Sergeant Miller next door. 7 fines for improper landscaping. Captain Reed down the street. 10 citations for an unauthorized flag because his stars and stripes was 4 inches too wide. The pattern was as clear as a thermal scan, but I needed the ground truth. On my Saturday morning run, I found the proof. Sheila's own fence had the exact same repairs I'd been cited for. Her husband's truck was twice as loud as mine. No fines, no warnings. By Sunday, I had enough evidence of discriminatory enforcement to keep a law firm busy for a decade. But I needed to see how deep the rot went. Monday brought a new low. Lily came home with a revoked invitation to the advanced STEM camp. "They said the spots are for permanent residents," she said, looking at the floor. The scent of cheap school cafe food and heartbreak followed her in. Leo's news was worse. 3 military kids were booted from the student council because their families were transient. Someone was poisoning the school board, and I knew exactly who was holding the vial. The sound of my mug hitting the granite counter was loud enough to startle the dog. It was the sound of a plan being finalized. At Wednesday's school board meeting, I sat in the shadows of the back row. Sheila Vance was at the podium, looking like a polished agent of chaos in a tailored suit. She'd formed the Suburban Stability Group, a handful of women acting as the self-appointed gatekeepers of the district. Under the humming gym lights, Sheila launched into a presentation. "We value our service members," she said with a smile that could freeze a river, "but their lifestyle brings a fundamental instability to our classrooms." The baggage of deployments creates a disruptive environment for our permanent children. She actually used the word baggage to describe the sacrifices of our families. I watched her with the cold detachment of a man watching a target walk into a trap. She was good. She had charts, mobility statistics, and rehearsed talking points. To an average civilian, she looked like a concerned mother. But then she made the tactical error of the century. She went personal. "Look at the Thorne family," she said, gesturing vaguely toward me without making eye contact. Multiple police calls, constant property violations, and children who struggle to integrate. This is the disruption we need to curb. My teeth nearly cracked from the pressure of my jaw clenching. She just put my kids in her sights in a public forum. The war was no longer just about a driveway. It was a full-scale assault on our right to belong. Thursday, I started calling every military family in the county. We have a saying, word travels fast. What I found was chilling. 14 families were being systematically pushed out through identical tactics. The coordination was too perfect. Every spike in harassment lined up with the date Sheila's husband lost his military contracts. This wasn't about rules. It was about a woman taking her husband's professional failures out on the community he couldn't sell to. Monday morning, I was loading the kids' gear when I saw her. She was filming us again, her phone held high. "Good morning, Sheila," I called out, my voice smooth and easy. She didn't say a word, just kept narrating into her device about intimidating glares. The smell of winter pine was in the air, a bizarre backdrop to her theater of the absurd. "Dad, why is she always watching us?" Leo asked. "She's just making sure we're famous, buddy," I said, waving at her camera. That afternoon, the escalation hit its peak. Deputy Miller was back at my door, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "Colonel, I'm sorry. We have a formal complaint of stalking and unauthorized surveillance of a minor. I have to ask, have you been tracking Mrs. Vance's movements?" I just smiled and invited him in. "Actually, Miller, I was waiting for you. Why don't you take a look at this digital map and tell me who's really doing the tracking?" The paperwork took 3 hours. I transferred enough money to buy a house into what was essentially the world's most expensive gate. Closing was set for Friday, giving me 10 days to build infrastructure that would make the Berlin Wall look like a garden fence. I spent the next week throwing money at contractors like a drunken lottery winner. Fence-Dike Construction got the call for 8-foot chain link with barbed wire and industrial locks. Precision Security designed a perimeter that would make the Pentagon jealous. I even ordered 20 private property signs large enough to be read from low Earth orbit. My only requirement: finish by Friday. Money was no object. Some people buy boats. I was buying the most satisfying enforcement project in legal history. Friday morning, as I signed the final papers, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was so perfect I laughed out loud in the quiet legal office. "Mr. Thompson, this is Delia Kramer. Your fence violations have escalated beyond acceptable limits. Meet me at your property line tomorrow at 8:00 a.m. sharp. This ends now." I showed the text to the closing attorney, who asked what was so funny about a threat. I explained it wasn't a threat. It was a formal invitation to watch someone walk into the most expensive trap in Tennessee history. Saturday morning at 7:55 a.m., I was standing at my boundary with a thermos of coffee and 21 pages of legal ammunition, watching Delia's BMW approach like a heat-seeking missile. The engine shut off with German precision, and out stepped our suburban dictator in her full battle regalia. A power blazer that screamed expensive lawyer, designer heels entirely unfit for Tennessee grass, and a leather briefcase that cost more than my truck payment. Behind her was a nervous man in khakis with surveying gear. I felt sorry for him. He was about to become collateral damage. Delia marched across my lawn with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never faced real opposition. Her stilettos punched perfect holes in my turf with every step. She stopped 6 feet onto my land and announced that we were finally going to resolve this fence situation, like civilized adults who understood community standards. I took a slow sip of coffee, agreed enthusiastically, and then casually mentioned she was currently committing criminal trespass by standing on my land without permission. She froze mid-stride, her suburban mom mask cracking to reveal the rage underneath. She launched into a prepared speech about my malicious interference with established traffic patterns that benefited the neighborhood. When I asked her to clarify those patterns, she actually said it out loud, that residents had used the convenient access route through my land for years. I pulled out my phone and started recording, asking her to confirm on camera that she was referring to a route used without a legal easement or written permission. With dramatic flair, she opened her briefcase and produced a thick manila folder. She announced her legal team had prepared documentation proving my interference was a public nuisance under Tennessee law. She handed me 15 pages of impressively manufactured legal fiction, complete with professional letterhead, official stamps, and enough jargon to choke a law school graduating class. She thought she'd won. She didn't realize that while she was printing fake documents, I was busy buying the dirt beneath her feet and the air she was breathing. Delia, Legal Analysis of Property Access Rights, was a masterpiece of manufactured fiction, covering everything from adverse possession to community benefit. It might have intimidated someone who hadn't spent a week studying actual law, but I just flipped through it while pointing out they'd overlooked a minor detail. When she snapped, demanding to know what, I pulled out the 2003 construction easement. I read the expiration date aloud, December 2004. The easement had been dead for 20 years, making every one of her convenient commutes a criminal trespass under Tennessee code. Delia's face turned 6 shades of red while her surveyor, Michael, suddenly stopped his work, realizing he was standing in legal quicksand. She tried to argue that law was flexible, but I explained that you can't establish a legal right by consistently breaking the law for 2 decades. In a desperate move, she called the county planning department right there. I sipped my coffee and watched the show. 5 minutes of frustrated shouting later, she hung up. The county had confirmed no such public route existed. Michael, the surveyor, then delivered the final blow. He refused to falsify a prescriptive easement claim, citing it as criminal fraud. That's when I dropped the nuclear bomb. I told her I'd closed on the Hartwell property yesterday afternoon. Her shortcut didn't just cross my land, it was now surrounded by it. Monday morning arrived like a war movie. 3 contractor trucks rolled in to begin the Great Fence project. They brought equipment fit for a federal prison and cameras enough to film a blockbuster. By 9:00 a.m., 8-foot chain link was rising, and motion sensors were being mounted every 100 feet. I was having the time of my retirement life. When Delia drove up, screaming about building codes, the foreman, a man who looked like he'd been installing barriers since the dawn of time, didn't blink. He calmly informed her that all permits were filed, the work was legal, and she needed to move her BMW because she was currently blocking equipment on private land. Delia's response was to summon every regulatory agency in Tennessee, from building inspectors to the sheriff. Over 2 hours of frantic calls, she discovered that 40 years of engineering experience makes for a bulletproof paper trail. I'd filed every permit and met every code with doctoral-level precision. Tuesday brought a fresh audacity, tire tracks across my original 15 acres. She was so desperate to maintain her shortcut that she'd bypassed the main fortification to trespass elsewhere. It was like a bank robber hitting the back door while police installed cameras at the front. I signaled Bobby to extend the line, merging both properties into one 55-acre fortress of enforcement. Wednesday saw her most desperate gambit. She arrived with a new surveyor, waving fabricated documents claiming errors in the county records that somehow placed my land within an expanded Willowbrook development zone. I invited the surveyor to compare his fiction against my certified copies from the clerk's office. I watched his professional credibility evaporate as he realized he'd been hired to validate a fantasy. He apologized, packed his gear, and fled, leaving Delia standing alone with her worthless papers, a woman discovering that reality doesn't bend to her expectations. Thursday escalated into a total meltdown. Delia showed up with bolt cutters. Hacking at the fence she claimed sat on HOA soil. Bobby called the sheriff while I recorded a high-definition record of her committing criminal property damage. Deputy Rodriguez arrived and explained that imaginary rights don't excuse criminal mischief. The look on her face when he offered her a choice between a peaceful exit or handcuffs was pure gold. She left screaming about federal violations, but Friday morning brought the absurd grand finale. Delia arrived with a moving truck and 2 day laborers. Her plan? To physically relocate my fence and carve out her own path. I watched this suburban general prepare her assault before calling my attorney, Sarah Kai. Sarah told me to keep the cameras rolling. She was bringing the paperwork to end this nonsense permanently. Sarah stepped out of her car with the look defense attorneys get when a client confesses on live TV. She watched Delia and her hired muscle attacking my fence with crowbars and started laughing so hard I thought she'd need a medic. Within 20 minutes, Sarah had documented the carnage, taken statements from Bobby's crew, and informed the day laborers they were committing felony property destruction on camera. They dropped their tools and vanished instantly, leaving Delia standing alone with a crowbar and a rapidly crumbling sense of reality. When Sarah warned her about the criminal implications, Delia screeched about interstate commerce regulations and HOA authority. That's when Sarah turned this local spat into a statewide scandal. She called Rita Walsh, an investigative journalist who lived for stories of suburban corruption. Rita was on site within 2 hours. By Saturday, a Channel 7 news van was idling on my grass. Rita interviewed Sarah on property law, talked to Bobby about the damage, and got Deputy Rodriguez to confirm that criminal charges were on the table. Sunday's lead story, HOA president accused of chronic trespassing, was a masterpiece. It used the expired easement and my video footage to paint Delia as a cautionary tale of unchecked entitlement. Monday morning, my phone didn't stop. Willowbrook residents, emboldened by the news, called to share their own horror stories of Delia's creative leadership. The fence dispute had cracked the dam, releasing years of complaints about financial irregularities and vote manipulation. By Tuesday, the state HOA Oversight Commission launched a formal investigation. Sarah called me Wednesday, her voice vibrating with excitement. The commission had found 3 years of missing improvement funds that had mysteriously funneled into projects for Delia's friends. They found proxy ballots from people who had moved away years ago, and a pattern of selective enforcement that looked more like racketeering than neighborhood management. The real bombshell, however, was buried in the meeting minutes Sarah had subpoenaed. The subpoenaed minutes were the smoking gun. They revealed Delia had been running the HOA like a personal cartel. She'd negotiated free landscaping for herself in exchange for exclusive contracts, secured discounted waste management while residents paid premiums, and even had the security firm monitor her home for free on the association's dime. Thursday morning, Sarah called with news that made me dance a jig. The state commission had issued an emergency suspension of Willowbrook's legal standing. Their authority was gone. Every fine, every antique ivory violation, and every contract Delia had ever signed was now legally void and subject to fraud review. Her empire hadn't just fallen, it had vaporized. The final blow came Friday when Deputy Rodriguez informed me that the DA was filing criminal charges for the fence incident. First-degree criminal mischief, trespassing, and conspiracy. Bail was set at $50,000, but the rabbit hole went deeper. Sarah's research revealed this was Delia's 3rd HOA presidency. She'd fled 2 previous communities under clouds of financial irregularities, always staying 1 step ahead of the law. This time, she'd picked the wrong retired engineer. The state's 73-page preliminary report was a masterclass in corruption, recommending total dissolution of the board and criminal prosecution for everyone involved. By Tuesday, a notice was taped to every door in Willowbrook. All HOA authority was suspended, and 3 years of fines were to be refunded with interest. The state's tip line was ringing off the hook as victims of Dilia's 20-year reign finally found their voices. Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after she'd attacked my property with a crowbar, I watched the news as Tennessee's most infamous HOA president was led away in handcuffs, charged with embezzlement, fraud, and racketeering. Thursday, the state receiver called to invite me to a mandatory community meeting on Saturday. I marked my calendar with the glee of a man who had spent $200,000 to watch a $500 fine turn into a life sentence for his enemy. Saturday afternoon arrived with crisp Tennessee clarity. The community center parking lot resembled a suburban refugee camp as residents gathered to learn the true cost of Dilia's leadership. I arrived early with Sarah Kai and Rita Walsh, whose camera crew was poised to capture the final chapter of this corruption saga. State Receiver Margaret Thompson took the podium at 2:00 p.m., reading a statement so devastating it effectively erased Dilia's reputation from the map. The investigation had uncovered over $400,000 in irregularities, diverted improvement funds, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and blatant insurance fraud for phantom property damage. The room went silent as the numbers climbed like a corruption jackpot. Then came the creative accounting. Thompson detailed landscaping contracts that billed the association for premium work, while board members received cut-rate services for free. There were security fees for uninstalled equipment and maintenance assessments for community facilities that had been closed for years. The room erupted into a low, angry hum as neighbors realized they'd been systematically robbed. What began as curiosity transformed into the kind of collective fury that makes politicians tremble. But the true nuclear bomb was still coming. Receiver Thompson revealed that the misconduct extended far beyond embezzlement. Dilia had been manipulating property assessments for tax purposes. Working with a corrupt county official, she had artificially inflated values for her enemies while slashing them for her supporters. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. It was systematic tax fraud stealing from schools and emergency services. The federal implications were massive. Mail fraud, wire fraud, and potential RICO violations for running a criminal enterprise under the guise of community leadership. Just as the weight of the revelation settled, a voice from the crowd asked the one question I'd been waiting for since this entire war began. Receiver Thompson's response was music to my ears. She confirmed the association had zero authority outside their boundaries. The easement had expired in 2004, and any claim of prescriptive rights was a legal joke. But then she buried Dilia. The investigation found that every cent spent on lawyers to harass me had been embezzled from the Community Improvement Fund. The room erupted. Residents were no longer just curious. They were a mob realizing they had been systematically robbed. Thompson restored order and oversaw a real election, one with paper ballots and zero proxy manipulation. The most satisfying moment came when the state's corrective plan was read. Every violation was canceled, every fine from the last 3 years would be refunded with interest, and all legal actions were dismissed with prejudice. My antique ivory fine was dead, my legal fees were reimbursed, and Dilia's campaign of harassment was now a criminal record that would haunt her forever. The applause was deafening. Rita Walsh asked me for a final quote, and I told her the truth. Sometimes the best defense against power is simply knowing the law better than those who think they're above it. Property rights still mean something in America, even if it costs $200,000 to prove it. 6 months later, I stood on my hilltop. The fence was still there, a monument to the war that cost Dilia her freedom, but the atmosphere had changed. The new board, made of actual neighbors, approached me with a proposal that restored my faith in community. They didn't demand a shortcut. They worked with the county to fix the actual road infrastructure, adding a traffic light that solved the 12-minute delay legitimately. Then they asked to lease a small strip of my land for a legal, surveyed emergency route. They offered fair market value, insurance, and a transparent contract. Standing there, watching the sunset over my 50 acres, I realized the victory wasn't just about the gate. It was about the transition from a suburban dictatorship to a neighborhood built on mutual respect. Justice had been served. My retirement was finally peaceful, and for the first time in 8 years, the only thing crossing my property line was a sense of genuine neighborly goodwill.